this line talks really a very simple hardware talk. I started with getting one of these to appear. One of them was flashing leads, and that's all. Doing was one of the chips I found was so the plug back was immediately override. So I fixed that chip. I found that I couldn't get USB. And so the USB chip itself had died, so I changed that. I've got one last chip to change. What I presume the problem was, pipes can actually have a sizable amount of voltage on a DC. So what I've got here is I've got this chassis here so that I can ground that chassis because there's a cable running through to the without actually putting this into the main. This is not something issue. And how I tested that is I just phones measured between the Perth wire on the board and chassis. There's 0.3. I know that there's a circuit to there, so I can plug that in and now the chassis on mains ground. Now to demonstrate, here's one of the in the box of things which came out put it into the mains. This is on. Measure between which is ground as well. DC on the plug back output, the power and channel. Two of them are actually like that. One, the other one is I'm not finding it like at all, but try the other one. And that one is $93. Whereas this one here, this third one's actually good. It's hundreds of millivolts, so not very much. So what happens with plug backs is because you don't have an earth pin, there's always some capacitive coupling between the mains and the DC that comes out. And so what it tends to do is it tends to drive that DC plug to somewhere in the middle of the AC voltage. So that's why you see the 80 or 90 volts on there. And it's only a few picofarad, a very small amount of capacitance connecting the two, but there's 95 volts there. So when you plug it in, whatever charge is there is going to dump itself across whatever you're plugging into. Which in our case, I think was probably this little guy. And if I plug it in, it just puts a job across the board. It took out the power supply away and then damaged the USB chip because the USB chip has actually a DC ground between the USB plug and the computer. So you've got this closed path. So as soon as you put that in, 90 volts has got to go somewhere and it goes across the board and takes out things on the way. The reason I know this is because I had I was doing some development with programming chips, FPGAs, with an interface called the JTAG port, which is how you program devices, you know. And it was old school, and it was you built your own JTAG, bit-banging JTAG programmer that plugged into the parallel port. So I had a laptop with its own plug pack, 2-pin plug pack, and my own homebrew programmer. And I kept losing these little chips. And so one day, when I went to plug it in, I not only found the chip was dead, it blew the top of the chip. And I thought, oh, there's a little crater there. Big bang and a little crater. I thought, something's wrong here. And that's when I discovered that this plug pack, which is a 2-pin one on laptop, actually had that same problem. I think it had about 127 volts there. So to solve that, I old school linear power supply and put a resistor between the linear supply and mains ground of a few K, just so that everything was kept at the right voltage, and never had a problem again. So the way to solve it, well, there's two ways you can solve it. Plug everything together. If you've got some sort of prototyping that you're doing, plug everything together, then turn on the mains, rather than charging this up at the mains and then applying it to your circuit by plugging in the DC. Or, and this is why this whole demonstration's point is, this is the plug pack I'm now using with the Opsis board, and it is a plug pack, but it is one with the mains ground. So if I plug that one, and I measure that one. Because the ground is on there and is coupled through there, it also ties the ground in some way onto the DC path, so that DC is at ground potential, at mains ground potential. So there's no way I'm going to kill anything with that. So I could literally plug that into an Opsis board all day, and it wouldn't cause any grief. So if you're going to do prototyping at home, where you bought your various things from Spark Company and whatever, you plug it all together and using plug packs to power them. The ideal way to do it is not to be very careful about how you plug things in, but simply use a plug pack that's got a ground on it as well. And you release the likely to cause any grief. It's only because of problem USB parallel ports where it is connected to the ground on your computer, whereas a Ethernet cable is isolated. So there's no problem with that. So yeah, so you just got to be mindful of that. That's all. That's the reason for my explanation. So you don't blow things up. Yeah. Okay.
Any question from Peter?
Oh, Peter.
So, Harry, if I have my laptop almost certainly has a 2-pin plug pack, how come it doesn't blow up when I unplug it in?
Not sure. Depends what you're plugging into. If you're plugging into something USB-ish that is completely isolated, then there's no problem, because there's no ground path to somewhere else. But Nick talked about some hi-fi gear he had at home, and things would behave strangely. I suspect that's probably the reason.
Because the entire laptop is floating at a particular ground,
whatever it is, and if you're plugging in a USB headphones or something else, they're not going away to ground, so you're not creating a path. Whereas here, we had connections. We have a connection which is grounded through USB and an external supply. So if you've got an external supply, that's where you've got to be very careful how it works. And you may find that this board, will praise to the guys that designed it, but perhaps it's not as robust, in the way it deals with surges. And the equipment you've got is, because they've made millions of them and they've made it a bit more robust.
And it's plugged into a power supply which has a little bit of isolation in it.
Yeah, well, it may be best. I mean, as I say, this plug back here, it was beautiful. And it's a 2-pin plug back, so I don't know how it basically does it, but maybe its isolation is better, and so it doesn't have those problems. Whereas these might be all cheap and cheerfuls, and they have a problem. And this laptop I had, we're going back to about 1994, it's a very old laptop, and maybe the supplies then were different. I noticed a lot of the laptop plug packs these days are not 2-pin. Quite a few of them are 3-pin, like a cloverleaf plug often, and there might be reasons for that. Now we've got so much stuff that's USB and things with the ground, whereas an Ethernet port, you wouldn't have that problem. So yeah, so it depends.
You get better reviews on Amazon if your machine blows up.
Exactly. You buy it anymore, so you make it better. So that's true. And so it is going to vary. But if you buy something from Sparkphone, it's a little tiny board that costs you $5, and it's powered by plug pack, then it's a bit open slater. It's a prototyping thing. It's just fun. So it's not necessarily real with robustness.
There's a picture that is probably on most of the 2-pin devices, which is like a square and a square for a double isolated
For the
device
plug packs?
that's supposed to be like that.
Yes.
But of course, some are more isolated than others.
Yeah, that's definitely so.
Yeah.
So what they do is they do a thing called stitching. They have layers of printed circuit board which overlap the live side and the non-live side, and that's a few picofarads of capacitance. And that the idea of that is to try and tie things together, even though they're isolated, to provide some sort of connection. But if that's enough to sort of drag the supply, I mean, admittedly, that's at 95 volts through a very high impedance meter, so there's no load on that. But you know, if it's sitting there with no load and you plug it in a load, whatever little bit of charge is still there's got to go somewhere, and so it goes through a circuit.
And the magic smoke comes out.
Sorry?
And the magic smoke.
The magic smoke. Well, in my case, the magic smoke cracked to left and right. That was spectacular. It's a great living experience. Anyway, no further questions.
Thank you. Thank you.